Good morning, everybody. It's now 10:30, so I'm going to get things started. My name is Melissa McKay, and I am the Communications and KTE Coordinator at Gambling Research Exchange Ontario. So I'm just going to go over a few technical aspects before I hand it over to Travis, who's going to get us started. So if you haven't already noticed, everybody's lines other than myself are on mute, and that's just to cut down on some background noise. So if you have a question when the presenters are going through their slides, please use the chat that you'll see to the right of the slides, and then I'll moderate the question and answer, and I'll speak up and make sure your question gets noticed by whoever's presenting at the time. So again, use the chat function to the right during the actual slide presentations if you have a question. And then towards the end, I'll open up all the lines and we can have a question and answer with all three of the presenters. And I just also wanted to let you know that this webinar is being recorded, and we will pass along the recording as well as the mindfulness manual itself after the webinar today. So I'm going to hand it over to my colleague Travis, who's going to introduce today's webinar and our three speakers. Travis, go ahead.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Travis Steinert. I'm a knowledge broker and the content specialist at the Gambling Research Exchange Ontario. So thanks for joining us. Today's webinar is Incorporating a Mind-Body Approach into a Problem Gambling Treatment Program. And we have three speakers for you today. I'm going to list them in the order that they'll be speaking. The first is Peter Chen. He works as an addiction therapist and education specialist for the Problem Gambling Treatment Program and the Education and Community Resource Program at the Center for Addiction and Mental Health. His expertise and passion include the integration of mindfulness meditation and clinical practice, and he has been teaching mindfulness groups at the Problem Gambling Institute of Ontario and CAMH for the past 7 years. Next, we'll have Nigel Turner speaking. He is an independent scientist with the Institute for Mental Health Policy Research at the Center for Mental Health and Addictions. Nigel is a well-published researcher in the field of gambling studies and focuses on risk factors for problem gambling and relapse. And last but not least, we'll have Farah Jindani, who works as a simulation education specialist at the Center for Addiction for Mental Health, where she develops and facilitates courses and training programs. She conducts research in the area of gambling, mindfulness interventions, and neuroscience and stress physiology. And with that, I'm going to hand off the reins to Peter Chen, who will be taking the first speaker.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Travis and Melissa and Grio for organizing this. I'm still trying to get used to this, talking to people and not being able to see them or checking whether they can hear me. So I'm assuming that everyone can hear me okay? I don't know. Maybe you could give me a sign somehow, send a message or something. Anyway, so welcome.
Peter, you're coming through loud and clear.
Thank you very much. Okay, so we called it welcome to incorporating a mind-body approach into a problem gambling treatment system. And we called it a mind-body approach, even though essentially what it is, it's incorporating mindfulness. But mindfulness is really more of a body-centered approach. Eckhart Tolle doesn't like to use the word mindful, for instance, because it's kind of like a misnomer. It's not really your mind being full. It's probably more the opposite. So hence the name Incorporating a Mind-Body Approach. And this is really exciting for us. Nigel, Farah, and I have been working on this for the past couple of years, doing research, and as Travis mentioned, we've been running mindfulness groups at CAMH Problem Gambling Service since 2006, and running 2 or 3 groups every year. And in the last couple of years, we've been doing research, and we'll talk about that, and also writing a manual, which has been completed and ready to be distributed. So let's begin. So this is our agenda. So we're going to talk about why implementing mindfulness in a problem gambling program. What's the rationale? We'll also talk about the research that I mentioned that we had done on the first couple groups that we started, that we had piloted at the gambling program. And after that, we'll talk about the current research that we just completed. And then we'll talk about the manual. So what is mindfulness? In a nutshell, Ron Siegel defines it as awareness of present experience with acceptance. So it has those three components. Different people might define it a little differently. For example, John Kabat-Zinn says mindfulness is paying attention on purpose in the present moment without judgment. So essentially, it's the same thing. So there's awareness, there's present experience, and there's acceptance. So Marlatt, and many of you may be familiar with the work of Marlatt. He was a pioneer in the field of relapse prevention, and so he talks about the experiential core of addictive behaviors as, and addictive behaviors would encompass not just substance use but gambling and other behavioral addictions. So notice the wording that he uses: suffering that arises from craving of or attachment to pleasurable experiences and the aversion to and desire to escape from distressing ones. So essentially, that is one version of a definition of some sort of a definition of addiction. So he's using words like suffering, cravings, attachment, pleasurable and experiences and aversion, and so on. And some of you may know that Marlatt was a meditator, long-time meditator, and so he really but he spoke about the benefits of developing a meditation approach when dealing with addictions. So why mindfulness in an addiction program or in a gambling program? So here are 4 aspects of mindfulness that can be useful for changing addictive behaviors, and this has been documented. And also I can speak from personal experience that this is how mindfulness can affect the impact it can have on an individual who practices it. And Viktor Frankl kind of summed it up by saying, as you can see in the quote below, between stimulus and response there is a space. In that space is our power to choose our response. In our response lies our freedom. And the word freedom is really important here. So it's gaining freedom. Freedom from what? Right? From freedom from the clinging and the pushing away. So I'll speak to these 4 aspects in a bit more detail. So mindfulness helps to cultivate awareness. It's also about acceptance-based coping. It's also known as a form of exposure therapy in some ways, and also can work well with a harm reduction approach. So mindfulness helps to cultivate awareness. So awareness of what? I mean, everybody is aware all the time, otherwise they would be, either dead or sleeping. But it's mindfulness helps to cultivate a different kind of awareness. Awareness, as Ron Siegel said, it's awareness in the present moment with acceptance. And also there's an emphasis on a practice in metacognitive awareness. So it's developing a different quality of awareness called metacognitive awareness. So being aware that you are aware, for instance, and cultivating the being mind as opposed to the doing mind, the doing mind is the mind that does a lot of thinking. And why is this awareness useful for dealing with gambling problems? So we know that the hallmark of addiction is denial, and really, the individual working hard at hiding this from them, not only themselves but from others. So developing awareness, as we know, even from a CBT perspective, can help with relapse prevention and awareness of high-risk situations. And I'll speak a bit more about that when we talk about the manual. So awareness of when you're in automatic pilot. Many of us operate on automatic pilot on a daily basis, partly because we do things, we get into a routine, we get into a habit of doing things, and it might be, so we get into automatic pilot mode. So mindfulness helps us to step out of that and not to identify with the thoughts that's happening in our mind. So seeing thoughts as passing mental events. The second aspect is acceptance-based coping. So we know that negative affect is a common relapse trigger, and avoidance and suppression are common ways of coping. Not only common in the general population, but especially with individuals who experience addiction to gambling, for instance. So I guess the common way of for them to deal with stuff is to avoid and suppress. Even in treatment programs, traditionally, when we're working with clients on triggers and coping strategies, when we would suggest that when clients get a trigger, we would suggest that they find ways to avoid it or to do something else. So with the mindfulness approach, it's more about the opposite. It's an acceptance-based approach. So when you get a trigger, learning to be with it and recognize it, but not to engage in it. So, and the literature indicates that acceptance-based strategies are more effective than avoidance-based strategies, at least in the long term. And mindfulness lessens attempts to suppress. So when people practice mindfulness, they become less inclined to have the need to suppress whatever is coming up. And another aspect of an acceptance-based coping is really it's about changing your relationship to the experience that you're having. Not changing the experience, but changing your relationship to it. An acceptance of whatever arises. The third aspect is exposure. As I mentioned, mindfulness can be seen as a form of exposure therapy, because when you're sitting quiet, for instance, what happens? What happens is stuff starts to come up, and often it might be negative stuff. Our secrets start to rise up. So mindfulness practice is about being with whatever arises without reacting. And noticing your tendency to cling to certain things and avoid certain things. So we want to get out of our mindset, because the reason why clients get involved with behaviors like gambling, substance use, and shopping or whatever is to avoid or suppress whatever is coming up for them. So here they're learning to be with it. Whatever is arising. So observing with curiosity and non-judgment. And this takes practice, right? It doesn't come overnight. And this type of practice helps to increase tolerance of distress and experience. And another important aspect of the practice is that you become aware of the impermanence of all things. And in this case, especially the impermanence of triggers or urges. Because when people get urges, they might think like, wow, this is not going to end. It's going to, I have to act on it in order to relieve it. And seeing thoughts and feelings as passing mental events. So not engaging in them. hence the metacognitive stance. The last aspect I'm going to talk about is harm reduction. So mindfulness works well, obviously, with an abstinence approach, but equally well with a harm reduction approach. For those who might be familiar with what's called the abstinence violation effect, so this is when someone has a slip, they might say something like, oh, I've already started gambling, I might as well go all the way and just blow everything. And the recognition that is just a thought, right? I already started gambling, I may as well go ahead and blow everything. It's just a thought. So seeing this as another passing mental event and learning to disengage from it and being able to make choices all along the way so that you don't have to go all the way. You can step out of the loop at any point. Another important aspect of a mindfulness approach is that it's approaching whatever's happening with compassion. Compassion not only for others, but for yourself especially, with curiosity and non-judgment. And then the last, okay, that was it. So those are the 4 aspects of why a mindfulness approach can be helpful for people struggling with gambling problems. Now I'm going to turn it over to Nigel to speak on the evaluation research. Nigel?
Move to the next slide.
Nigel, there's just a little bar along the top. You'll see 10 and an arrow on either side.
Yeah.
You just use that.
Okay. Thank you. I got into this project because Peter Chen had some information, some evaluation documentation that he had collected for his group, and he wanted to know can we scientifically validate the value of his mindfulness group. There has been previous research on mindfulness. A number of people have looked in this area, and it's been used in a lot of different help people deal with a lot of different issues. For example, chronic pain. There's a number of studies that have found it very helpful to help people deal with chronic pain. Mental health problems, Siegel et al. 2012. Dealing with cancer, McKenzie et al. 2007. Addictions, Bowen, 2011. And most recently, problem gambling has been looked at by Christensen et al. 2013 and by Peter Chen and myself in 2014. To evaluate the group, we had some qualitative and some quantitative information about that the participants had filled out about the group. One was the Mindfulness Attention Awareness Scale, or the MAAS, by Brown and Ryan, 2003. It's 15 items, including things like I could be experiencing some emotion and not be conscious of it until sometime later. And I tend to not notice things of physical tension or discomfort until they really grab my attention. There are a number of items that are scored, and they're scored in terms of the mindful response, which is that this is not true of them. We also have ratings of the program's quality. How important was this program to you? We also had qualitative evaluation of the groups was done using a course reflection questionnaire. It was 7 open-ended questions about their experiences. What did you find most valuable about this course? What, if anything, did you learn? What, if anything, has changed for you over the past 8 weeks as a result of your participation? People responded to these, and then we organized the information that they wrote and then examined it for themes. The MAAS, comparing week 1 and week 8 comparison, less behavior equals more mindful. So if it's always true, it's a 1, and if it's never true, they get a 6. So I could be experiencing some emotion and not be conscious of it until later. That's not a mindful response. So if this is almost never, then this would be scored a 6, so the person is mindful. The pre-treatment mean was 3.65 with a standard deviation of 1.01. The post-treatment mean was 4.40. So this means there's a substantial increase in the mindfulness of the participants between the pre-treatment and post-treatment. This is significant. It's also significant if we do an intent to treat analysis. And the average score was, it had a Cohen's D of 1.18. That's a very large impact, a very substantial improvement in the mindfulness based on this MAAS scale. The items, we also looked at the items to see which items changed the most. And items such as I tend not to notice feelings of physical tension or discomfort until they really grab my attention. This produced a very large change. I find myself preoccupied with the future or the past. This showed a large change, so that people are less preoccupied with past or future. I tend to walk quickly where I'm going without paying attention. That also showed a large change. Some of the items that changed the least were I snack without being aware of that I'm eating. I break or spill things because of carelessness, not paying attention. I drive to places on autopilot and then wonder where I went. So these show that there is still some room for improvement in the mindfulness of the participants, but we were overall very impressed by the reported improvement in their mindfulness. They also rated the program very highly. Out of 10, the average score was 6.8 on a 10-point scale. 8.6. In terms of, I plan to continue formal practice of mindfulness, 8.7 out of 10, on a 10-point scale. And I plan to continue to informally practice mindfulness, 8.9 on a 10-point scale. So this means the people reported that they are going to be continuing to use these practices in their day-to-day life. Then we had the qualitative feedback based on the course reflection. And we broke this down into 7 themes. There's 7 themes that people found. This is what they got out of this course. The first one was mindfulness techniques. How important is to breathe? Learn how important it is to breathe and slow down. Three-step breathing space. Increased awareness of triggers and ability to cope. Mindfulness awareness of warning signs and triggers is my main tool for not returning to coping via gambling. So this shows the person's using this in their day-to-day life to help them cope. A third theme was feeling calmer, more relaxed, and more patient. Even though being calm and relaxed isn't the main focus, people reported that they learned how to calm down and were less anxious as a result of being more mindful of their responses. Improved self-discipline, control over gambling. And, of course, this is the primary reason for running these groups. So people reported being able to control going on autopilot, so not getting into that automatic process where they just go gambling in order to deal with distress. Better interpersonal skills, much better listener and not affected by small things. 6 was positive experiences in their life, helping them with their job or career because they're able to calm down and relax and deal with distress in a more productive way. That it actually helps them not just with their gambling problems but other things in their life. Then there's barriers to meditation. I found the amount of time suggested for homework not realistic. So there were some problems that people ran into, but this was actually the least likely theme to come up in the feedback. And now we're going to turn it over to Farah for the next section.
Okay, hi Hello, everybody. So my involvement in this project started in 2010 when my background's in social work, so I was helping Peter conduct the mindfulness groups, and then as part of my postdoc, we became interested in building on some of the prior research that Nigel was just speaking about to start to look at how maybe we can start to implement some other facets into the research, which I'll speak about. So, building on what Nigel was just talking about, we came up with the idea of really starting to review the entire research base on what exists around mindfulness as a treatment for problem gamblers. And we found that there wasn't a whole, there's a great deal of research on problem gambling, on mindfulness, but not really all of these aspects together. So we were starting to pull from these different fields, and then decided to run a pilot study to look at how mindfulness is impacting gamblers and people who have problem gambling issues using both questionnaire data, EEG study, which I'll talk to you a little bit more, and we also got participant feedback. So asking participants about the program, how did they find the manual that Peter's going to talk about in just a moment, and this was done through a semi-structured interview. So we had 27 people participate, and 80% of that population was male. The average age was 47, and these were people who were taking part in the mindfulness groups in the problem gambling service at CAMH. 85% of the individuals who did participate in the study didn't have any prior experience with mindfulness. And as I mentioned, we collected a number of questionnaire data. So the MAAS that Nigel just described, an emotional regulation scale, which is called the DERS. We also asked about gambling triggers and urges. And we conducted an EEG at 4 time points. So basically, before they went through the 8-week mindfulness group, they would come in for a pretest, and we would collect EEG data both at time 1, which was immediately prior to starting the group. We would then do a body scan, a 5-minute body scan, and we would collect a second EEG collection point. And then after the group was finished at 8 weeks, they would come in and we would conduct the same procedure again. So they would fill in the questionnaires, that we would collect an EEG, and then they would do a body scan, and we would collect time 4 EEG data. And then after the group as well, we would have that semi-structured interview that I just mentioned. So currently, the research suggests to us around mindfulness that people who participate in a mind-body intervention are going to have greater attentional control. So this relates to what Nigel was talking about earlier around, so people can become more aware and attuned to what is happening in the present moment. And this is related to increased alpha power. So I'm not going to go into all of the details of what exactly is happening in different areas of the brain, but basically this is the frontal cortex, which there's a great deal of stimulation there when people are feeling anxious or impulsive. And so when there's increased alpha, basically one is more relaxed and attuned sensorially to what is happening in the body. This is related to increased performance cognitively with memory and decision making as well, which for people who are gambling, we know that there's a connection with impulsivity. So I'll talk about that a little bit more. People are able to be aware of what's happening in their environment, but they're not getting caught up in all the gambling-related triggers, for instance. This will be related to this idea of one can become more aware emotionally of what's happening for them. So rather than this impulse that tends to happen, I want to gamble, and people are immediately, the next thing they know, they're gambling, one can actually start to become aware of what's happening in their body and start to recognize physiologically how they're feeling as well. And this is also related to reward processing and decision making. So we looked at the MAAS data similar to what Naja was talking about in the pilot for this particular group of participants again, and we see that there was an increase in attention post the mindfulness group, and the effect size was moderate to a high effect size, and that was significant. We also looked at gambling-related cravings for this population, and we see that there was an effect here as well. We also looked at how much people were spending, what were their trends in gambling, were they meeting their goals, and we didn't see a huge number of differences here. Also in emotional regulation, those scales did not reach what we would call statistical significance, but we did see trends in a positive direction. So turning to the EEG data that I was mentioning that we collected at 4 time points. Basically, EEG is a way to record brainwaves. So that's electrical activity that's produced by the brain. So basically what happens is that electrodes are placed on the scalp, and alpha brainwave activity is the most dominant that can be measured. It's also related, as I mentioned earlier, to relaxation and attention. But when I say relaxation, I'm not talking about just one feels more calmer and relaxed, but what we actually find is that in that state of greater alpha power, when one is relaxed, they're actually also more attuned to what's happening both internally and externally. And prior research has also shown that uses more neurophysiological data is that mindfulness is related to and correlated with increased relaxation, memory, learning, and concentration. So our results, and this is, I really do want to iterate that this is one aspect of the results, and I'm just kind of giving an overview, but basically what we found is that what you see, the image on the left is brain, and the areas that, and you see these, like all these areas that are listed here are where the electrodes were. What you see in the red are the frontal lobes that we actually looked at that are related to alpha power. You'll then look at the graph that's on the right portion of the screen, and at time 1 and time 3 are particularly what we're looking at, because this is the alpha power at those time points, because at time 2 and time 4 they were actually doing a body scan, so we looked at those areas differently. But you'll notice that at time point 1 and time point 3, for all of the electrodes there was a significant increase in this alpha power and the alpha brainwave activity that's related to attention that I've been talking about so far. So that correlates nicely with the questionnaire data around attention that we've been speaking to up this far. So basically, again, just to summarize, is that participants were stating by self-report that they were feeling more attuned and more attentive to what was happening, but we were seeing similar results in their EEG activity in the brain. We also did interviews, as I mentioned, with the participants at the end of the program that we looked at qualitatively. So this was basically looking at the narratives and then picking up themes that they discussed themselves. And we found that around psychological impact, and this is again one area of the qualitative findings that we were looking at, people were mentioning that they had an increased understanding of their and awareness of their own gambling-related triggers. So they were becoming, again, more aware of what was happening rather than just reacting and acting based on their triggers, a greater level of awareness, being able to actually walk through some of the strategies and tools that they had learned in the group to focus, for instance, on their breath, talk themselves through some of the stress, actually utilize many of the strategies that they had learned in the group. They had greater self-compassion around gambling and some of the mistakes and things that had happened in their lives for both themselves and other people. They stated very clearly that they had learned some new coping strategies around mindfulness, through coming to the mindfulness groups, even though the groups weren't heavily based on processing in the group, they were able to relate many of the skills that they had learned to relationships in their lives and emotions overall. So also outside of gambling, but life more generally. And they reported decreased isolation. So getting out, connecting with people more, and also found the group to be a huge support overall. So overall, we found that the mindfulness groups had been integrated well into the problem gambling treatment program at CAMH, in the problem gambling service, that we found both results in the self-reported measures of the MAAS data, the qualitative findings when participants spoke to us around their narratives of their experience, and then also the EEG results. And the clients also gave great feedback on how they found the groups to be quite positive. And the mindfulness group is one of the best attended groups at the PGIO at CAMH. So I'll turn it back to Peter to walk us through some aspects of the manual.
Okay. Thank you, Farah. So people can hear me okay now? Okay. So if not, just let me know. So just before I get into the manual, I just wanted to mention that the research that we've conducted so far has been on an 8-week mindfulness group. Now, some mindfulness programs, they usually have, other than the 8 weeks, they usually have one day, an entire day of meditation. So a one-day mindfulness retreat. We haven't done that because of resources. My point being that if we had done that, the impact, the results you would have seen would have been even more, I suspect would have been even more significant. It already is significant, but it would have been even more so if we had done the one-day retreat. So I just wanted to talk now, just give some highlights about the manual. And after I show some of the highlights, Melissa will show you the actual manual that we created and will be disseminated to everyone. So certain aspects. Okay, first of all, I mentioned it's 8 weeks. The manual was based on the mindfulness-based stress reduction, mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, and mindfulness-based relapse prevention protocols. And some of you may be familiar with these. The first one being by John Kabat-Zinn, the MBCT protocol being by Siegel, Williams, and Teasdale, and the MBRP relapse prevention manual by Bowen, Chola, and Marlatt. So there's 8 weeks, as I mentioned, and these are the 8 weeks. So here are the titles. So we wanted to keep the same type of flow of progression of the mindfulness topics from week to week. So increasing in difficulty and specificity. So starting with recognizing that one is an automatic pilot, and being introduced to mindfulness, to what is mindfulness, through the mindful eating, raising exercise, and the body scan. Then looking at developing awareness more generally, and in the second week we talk about barriers to practice. That's really important because barriers are quite common when people try to meditate. Then we start to focus in a bit more and looking at mindfulness in everyday activities. So mindfulness, mindful walking, mindful when you're brushing your teeth, taking a shower, eating, and so on. And then we start to become more specific by being mindful when at risk to gamble. And I'll speak more to that in a bit. And as I mentioned earlier, so in week 5, we look at cultivating a different relationship to experience through acceptance and clear seeing. And then in week 6, it's really looking at seeing thoughts as passing mental events. Because this comes in week 6 because it's people, we get so caught up in our habits of mind that it's really hard to disengage from thoughts. So this comes up week 6. And then in week 7, it's looking at being good to yourself, because as you know that a lot of people who get into problems with addiction, they really are maybe hard on themselves, a lot of guilt and shame. So being good to themselves, so doing a loving kindness practice, and introducing the notion of self-compassion that was pioneered by Kristen Neff and Christopher Germer. And then at the end, maintaining practice after the group ends, so looking at resources in the community that they might be able to connect with. These are also 3 sections in the manual that's different from others. So looking at mindfulness and diverse populations, mindfulness and how mindfulness can be helpful for people with trauma, and research on mindfulness and gambling problems that Nigel spoke about earlier. And Farah is currently completing. One interesting about mindfulness and diverse populations one thing that I found interesting, well, actually not just one thing, but Thich Nhat Hanh had said when you're teaching mindfulness to different populations, it's important. It's not so much about strategy, what strategy you use, but it's important about developing relationship. Developing a relationship with the people that you're teaching, and also to understand their suffering. So whether it's racism or sexism or poverty or trauma, to understand what their suffering is. So these are 3 sections that I wanted to highlight. So I'm just going to talk a bit about some other sections in the manual. So there's a section on urge surfing, and some of you may be familiar with this. I don't know if any of you all have used urge surfing in working with clients with substance use or with gambling. So this is an important. This is a technique that can be used. So seeing urges as like a wave, and riding the wave, and with your surfboard, and the surfboard being like your breath, right? So the important thing about this is to recognize that urges come and go. They're impermanent. They don't last forever. The next section is there's a yoga section. So this is one of the practices amongst others. So there's a section on yoga. So even though it's called mindfulness, movement is an important part of mindfulness practice, because it helps one to get into the body. And so Farah I don't know if you all know, but Farah is Dr. Jindani is a yoga instructor. She really helped us to develop this section. And the inventory of gambling situations, the IGS. Some of you may be familiar with this. This is similar to the inventory of drinking and drug situations. And this IGS was developed by Dr. Turner and Nina Littman Sharp. So it's a questionnaire that clients complete, and it gives them feedback on what their high-risk situations are. It's some of the triggers are common to other addictions, but some are unique to gambling. Here there are. So there's 10 categories. So negative emotions, conflict with others, pleasant emotions, social pressure, need for excitement. So these first ones are common to others to substance use. But then worried about that, winning and chasing, confidence and skill is specific to gambling. Testing personal control and urges and temptations are also similar with substance use. So in I think it's week 4 in the mindfulness protocol that we developed, we look at this this inventory of gambling situations, and this can help clients to recognize their their urges and put them in these different categories and ways of coping with them. So here's another section in the manual, again in the high-risk situations section, being mindful when at risk to gamble. So here is a flow chart, so to speak, where you start with a trigger on the left side, and then you can go one of two ways. One is to react and dream of a win. So dream of a win is basically thinking, right? So thoughts about winning, and then thoughts about belief in the win, and so on. So they get caught up in the gambling cycle again. Or the second option is to respond from a mindfulness place. So practicing the 3-step breathing space, observing thoughts as just thoughts, and then responding with awareness and detachment and no gambling. Walking meditation is another section in the manual. So it's an opportunity to practice mindful walking, to be more present in their body, aware of their surroundings while walking. I mean, how many times someone may have walked and not really paying attention to where they're going. And nowadays, that's especially important to introduce mindful walking, because of technology nowadays is so much taking people out of the present moment experience with cell phones, iPods, and so on. And so here's some graphics that the artist on our team, Dr. Turner, helped us to develop. So mindful walking, this is a handout that the clients can receive on mindful walking. So the top is not mindful, the bottom is mindful walking. So being present with their experience of walking rather than caught up in thinking. So the conclusion is that okay. So anyways, the manual is now in the final stages. Well, actually, it's actually completed and ready to be distributed, thanks to GRIO, Gambling Research Exchange Ontario. And now Melissa is going to highlight some parts of the manual for you all. So this is the manual. So this is the first page, and then we can maybe scroll down and look at, so here's a table of contents. Is it possible to make it bigger?